Next fight, we got an interesting fight, Victor Petrino and Tyson Pedro. And the reason why it's interesting, it's more interesting on the Victor Petrino side, the Vitor Petrino side, for the mere fact that, Tyson Pedro came into the UFC, and this was a guy that, like, when that whole Aussie movement, came over, he was one of the leaders. He was like one of the guys that, like, everybody was looking to, even the UFC. Good-looking guy, marketable, had a decent skill set, tied a couple wins in a row. And then all of a sudden, it's just like he started to digress. He started to get hurt. He started to, excuse me, not really well round out his game. Like, he never evolved. And that evolution could have been stunted by, his injuries, all the time off and stuff like that. Then he comes back and he makes a little bit of a comeback. What does the UFC do? He leaves since 2018. He comes back in 2021, which is a decent layoff. Comes back, he fights Ike Villanueva, who was old as the hills, and he beats him, no longer in the UFC. He beats Harry Hunsucker, no longer in the UFC, horrible. Then he goes against a guy who's moderately good in Bukauskas, and he loses to him. Comes back in his last fight, and he beats the Pleasure Man, which I actually picked Pedro to win that fight. I don't know why people were on Antov in that fight so heavily. I think it was more not his skill set. I think it was more because they weren't believers in Pedro. And I'm not a believer in Pedro. I think Pedro's very, very talented, but I think sometimes he's his worst enemy, right? So now he's going against a guy in Vitor Petrino who's a unit. I mean, let's face it, the guy's a unit. The guy beat Bukauskas, he beat Prashniau, he beat Pleasure Man, he beat Rodolfo Bellato. So, this is all within the UFC, these four fights. So he's on a kind of a 4-fight win streak if you want to count the Contender Series, right? The guy's cardio checks out. The guy's athletic ability checks out. The guy's power checks out. Like, everything with this guy kind of checks out, but he's never really been dragged into these deep waters with a guy that can kind of meet him universally everywhere. You know what I mean? And you got a guy in Pedro who, technically wise, skill wise, he can meet him on the feet. He looked very good in his last fight, working over at City Kickboxing now, utilizing his range much better, picking and choosing his spots much better. He's got a tricky ground game. That's interesting in spots that when he first came into the UFC, it looked like that was kind of his focal point a little bit. So technical wise and skill wise, and as far as the veteran savvy and having the experience, he meets all those boxes with Petrino. But it's just a momentum thing for me. It's a activity thing for me, and I don't know how much more Pedro has to give. You know what I mean? And that's what bothers me here. This is a fight, clearly, I think, that they want Petrino to win. I think he's got a lot of upside. Like I said, if you look at the guy, his physique, his athletic ability, his power, everything about him, the guy has very good upside. He's got a decent ceiling, where Pedro, they're feeding him all these lower level guys, and they're trying to help him. They fed him Hunsucker. They fed him Villanueva. They still believe in him. They're walking him. But then he comes back and he fights Bukauskas and he loses. Then they give him Pleasure Man and he wins. Now, the Pleasure Man was a good fight. It was a good win for him. But it wasn't anything that's going to blow your hair back, because he's not that great in itself. So this is kind of a test for both guys. This is to see, like, where is Tyson Pedro really? Like, where is he? Is he really back? Did he make some kind of evolutionary changes? And also on Petrino is, how is he going to fare against somebody who can kind of meet him technical wise if he comes in as Tyson Pedro, the good version of Tyson Pedro? How is he going to handle that when the deep water starts coming, and this guy starts getting matched in some spots? So it's an interesting fight, but I just think Petrino's going to catch him. I think eventually, at some point in time, the athletic ability, the explosion, the confidence, the momentum, I think all that plays in his favor here. So I'm going to go to Petrino, and I'm going to go Petrino inside the distance.